Chapter 14, Lecture A. It's been a while since I've lectured from this class, but this is Lecture 14A. We're getting into a new birth of freedom. Introduction, we'll get here in a second, but it's pages 401 to 440 in the books. Remember, as always, not everything will be in the lecture, or will never all be on the PowerPoint if you're looking at it. Okay. Focus questions. Why is the Civil War considered the first modern war? How did a war to preserve the Union become a war to end slavery? How did the Civil War transform the national economy and create a stronger nation state? How did the war effort affect the society and economy of the Confederacy? And what were the military and political turning points of the war? And then finally, what were the most important wartime rehearsals for Reconstruction? So introduction here. Marcus Spiegel was a Jewish immigrant who wanted to preserve the Union. As the war dragged on, he saw the horrors of slavery and became anti-slavery. Millions of Northerners finally realized that to preserve the Union, this required the destruction of slavery. And why this is important to look at a story of like unknown person named Marcus Spiegel here is he saw firsthand the horrors of slavery. Though initially he may have not have been anti-slavery or even wanting to push for the abolition of slavery, he really sees at firsthand why this probably should be done away with. If the Union is to preserve, this whole idea of slavery has to be done away with. He is not alone. There is countless unnamed people that are going to start to realize in order for the Union to move forward to be a true republic, elements of democracy, and a country that is truly free, slavery has to be abolished. That is not a notion that is easily arrived at, and that will be something that will develop throughout the war. In 1860, as we go through this, Lincoln never once ran with the idea that I'm going to abolish slavery. I'm just going to keep it from spreading. There's a difference there. Southerners, though, will view the whole Lincoln presidency, the whole early years here, as Lincoln's going to end slavery. So their narrative and the Northern's narratives and all that don't match. But perception's reality, and this is going to lead into what we know as the Civil War. Now, the first modern war. It's often called the first modern war. It's the first time mass armies fought on the battlefield with modern weapons from the Industrial Revolution. Some will argue that the Crimea War in the 1850s is the first modern war, though on smaller scale. This is the first modern war, and we have mass casualties at a high level. Now, the machine gun does not exist in its modern format. It is more the Gatling gun, more heavy artillery starts to be developed here, ability to recharge your weapons faster, and just deployment of troops into mass, thousands of troops out on the battlefield confronting each other. The other thing about the first modern war, it's also using the industry to develop, such as weapons, bullets, trains for movement. This also the war becomes a society versus society. So you have the northern way of life, the agro-business of the South versus the northern's industrial trade. This changed the dynamic and made it a total war. So not only is it an industrial war, it is a war against basically competing societies, and being the North versus the South. Really, the Civil War is the dress rehearsal, if you want to call it, for what will become about 60 years later, World War I. And why I say it's the dress rehearsal, if you look at the positioning of troops, what would be the later entrenchment of troops in World War I, a lot of that basis or concept is born in the Civil War. Now, we don't have massive trenches like we do in World War I in the Civil War, but the Civil War definitely sets in motion the idea of entrenching and being unmovable. And that's something we can talk more about later. But the two combatants, all comparisons heavily favor the Union before the start of the war. I mean, in my American history classes that I teach to my sophomores, we go into great detail about comparing the two, and we go into great comparison of talking about the advantages and disadvantages both have. The Union had to invade and conquer a larger area than Western Europe. That's very big. Think about World War I, good comparison here. Western Europe, really the battlefront of what would become the Western Front, is quite small in comparatively what the Union had to go here and compete and control. Confederate soldiers were highly motivated fighters. If you break down at the onset, the South numerically is disadvantaged, but on the intangibles such as motivation, home turf, home field advantage, better competency from their leadership and their generals. The South has the initial advantage on that, though they numerically are disadvantaged. They have the intangibles that are very, very important. Stuff you can't coach, is the coaching analogy here. North soldiers were farm boys, shoekeepers, artisans, and urban workers, and they were not necessarily motivated by their homes being affected by the war. Southern soldiers, most of them were non-slaving small farmers with slave owners dominating the officer corps or not even fighting at all. So you have a drastically different type of military. The Northern is what you would think, even of the modern military. You have a collection of individuals from different backgrounds. Officers were very wide range. Most of the officers obviously would come from West Point or elite families, but the military is very comprised in the North of a wide spectrum. The Southern military, on the other hand, and this will become a disadvantage later, is a reflection of the society at the time. So if I told you you two were poor white farmers in the South, or you think you're going to get a sweet position in the military, or you're going to be a lowly, do anything I tell you type person in the military? Yeah, you're going to get a crappy job, right? Thus, they reinforce the stereotypical racial and even hierarchical society within the military ranks. At the end of the day, that will come back to bite the South in the foot, because as the war drags on, people are like, whose war am I really fighting for? Okay, the first modern war, 2. Looking at this next one, technology of the war. None were prepared for the war technology with what it brought. The first war used to transport troops and supply via railroad. This is not necessarily what we would later call mechanized fighting, like what you get with tanks and the automobile and armored vehicles, but it is a forerunner to that, where you could load a train with hundreds of troops and move them within hours to another location, miles, or if hundreds if not thousands of miles away. Second was the first war of ironclad ships, metal over wooden. You have the introduction of metal onto vessels now. First time in history that you have what we would call almost battleship-like things. The most famous, the Merrimack versus the Virginia, or the Merrimack versus the Monitor, or sometimes it's called the Virginia. The ironclads, the first cannonballs bouncing off the ships. But after this war, you'll start to see all the Navy going through a radical transformation from wooden to metal. The use of the telegraph, first time in history. Now you're going to have literally what is going on the battlefield. Someone hooks into the telegraph line, can give you updated battlefield things. It's really the first. And Lincoln would go down and camp at the War Department, and literally could make decisions right there on the spot with information he had, without having to wait days or weeks for the information they get to him by foot. Revolution in arms manufacturing, more accurate weapons are created, and you have mass production of weapons. Over 750,000 believed died during the conflict. It is the bloodiest conflict in American history. And you're looking at probably, I think most military deaths is 600,000 to 700,000. But out of all wars America's ever fought, this is the bloodiest war the United States ever fought, mostly because it's a civil war. Medical care remained primitive. Usually if your arm was badly wounded, it meant amputation. So you have a lot of cripples that come from this war by losing legs and arms. Troops captured and kept in Harp's prisons when they were captured, leading to a lot of negative aspects of this thing. Now, the public in the war, vast propaganda on both sides, obviously trying to sell their things. And obviously the South still even uses propaganda today to justify a lot of the aspects of the Civil War. Sometimes slavery is completely forgotten in some curriculum on the Civil War, and you cannot separate the two. And I'd say that with caution, not picking on any one group or people, but there's people that want to revise history and kind of exclude the whole aspect of what slavery played in the Civil War. They'll wrap it up in states' rights as a cause, which is states' rights regarding slavery. Vast propaganda, as I said. North reaffirmed Northern values. Tear the Democratic Party apart for good reason. You're going to have people that are going to say there's treason, accused the South of numerous crimes, and it's just going to be tears the Democratic Party apart. War correspondents, reporters brought the news to the people in detail, and those that spoke out of the government will later be silenced, and we'll get to that when talk about Lincoln suspending habeas corpus. But like, the war is not popular, and for obvious reasons. The South is much more motivated than the North, and the Northerners are going to kind of rebuke the war a little bit initially, and thus why the success of the war early on is not very favorable for the North. Now, mobilizing resources. War found both sides prepared for war, but it also found them ill-prepared. Most of them didn't understand how this war was going to go forward. In 1861, no additional railroad gauge, or no national railroad gauge, this between two rails, so trains could not run on another track. This was a way the railroad companies kept their railroad's integrity, was that you could vary your railroad distance apart, and your rival trains couldn't go on them. Thus, it would be harder to basically switch trains from railroad track to railroad track or connect railroad tracks when they often would not match. So that made it difficult to some degree. And then also you think about the railroads in general. The South was not as near connected as the North was. So the North had a greater ability to move things very quickly, where the South was much more rural-based and very spread out farther. So this whole railroad connection wasn't even an advantage for the South at some points. No national banking system, no tax system capable of raising funds. This is 60 years before income tax becomes available. Not even enough accurate maps of the southern states to know where the exact borders were or things were at times. So you can see here that there's a lot of issues with the pre-war or going into the early stage of the war. Lincoln's blockade of the South only became effective later on as more ships were added to the Navy, though that will have a huge effect on the war. Problems of purchasing and distributing the food, weapons, and other supplies, your logistics, was not well in place. The Union Army eventually became the best fed and best supplied force in history. But on the onset, it's not. Until they get the mechanisms to complete that, it's going to be a very rugged and slow process. Now, problems of purchasing, and so the South, on the other hand, initially they were ready, they're good, but once the war goes on, their logistics, going back to that kind of railroad and other aspects, is going to lag behind the Army. And this is where we get into later in the later war with like Grant. Grant understood logistics. Logistics wins war. And then, they had the old UPS talking about business stuff. Businesses are successful that understand how they can distribute their products effectively. Just think about the rise of Amazon and other companies. How you effectively distribute your materials will lead to your success, and no different than war. Military strategies. Confederacy adopted a defensive strategy, outlast, kind of like what George Washington did in the American Revolution. North initially attempted to capture Richmond and attack it sporadically, and the North initially kind of played on, if I capture your capital, you'll surrender, that the Europeans are kind of always thought about. But in this war, we realized catching a capital is not going to make a difference. The British learned this in the War of 1812 and the American Revolution. Capturing the capital really doesn't end the war. And the same thing in Hitler in World War II. Lincoln realized it would take much more than capturing small amounts of territory to get the South to end the war, and the South way of life had to become a target, and that will evolve as a military target later on in the war. So, as you see here, early on, both sides are kind of prepared for war, but not really prepared for war, really for the most part. They are, as far as maybe psychologically, they're ready to get just to settle this whole slavery dispute. But the reality is, neither side is ready for the horrors that the Civil War is going to bring. And as we learned in Chapter 13, the Civil War really it starts with the Confederates firing at Fort Sumter in 1861, and then the South fires first, and that's where everything will mobilize for them. But once again, just to kind of recap, I don't want to get into the war begins part. I'll start that on the next lecture. But to recap here a little bit, I think it's like 3-to-1 ratio, population-wise. The North is vastly far more populated than the South. Industrial, the North can produce not just weapons, ammunition and all that, things of war, but clothing, food. The North is able to move mass amounts of logistics, supply their military, etc. Additionally, the North, most of the fighting is going to be in the South, and though that's an advantage for the South with the home field advantage, Northerners' properties are not going to be destroyed because of the war, where Southerners are going to be. So, and then the railroads is not even close. The North has vast more railroad systems than the South does, and then most of the nation's initial economic powers in the North as well is, the banks and, the federal government. Everything's in place for the North to operate. The South has to create from anew. The other thing that I didn't mention is, as the war begins and the Confederate States are created, they're going to model themselves at the Articles of Confederation, which were all the powers of the states. Thus, the CSA, the Confederate States of America, are going to be very weak. They cannot agree on anything. It's going to be modeled off that old system, and the states are going to rebuke. They're not going to be able to raise taxes, and they're going to be fighting and positioning, which is going to be really their downfall. So, as this war gets off, there are a few, but there's not everyone, but those who understand the longer aspects realize the South has to win this war very quickly. If they don't, they will lose the war. And as we get into the war strategies, you'll kind of see that happen. Have a good day.